Hello everyone. Good afternoon from Berlin. A warm welcome to all members of Atlantik-Brücke, as well as everyone watching the live stream on YouTube. Thank you very much for joining today's virtual discussion, which is part of Atlantik-Brücke's series called Better Be Prepared. And I think today we're covering a topic for which a lot of decision makers were not quite prepared, or that at least a lot of us surely didn't have on the agenda for 2025, which is the new race for Greenland. And I think it's fair to say, at least that's true for me, that for a lot of people, Greenland has long been a white spot on the map, quite literally. However, US President Donald Trump has certainly put it on the very top of the geopolitical agenda. Other major powers are also drawing attention to Greenland, such as Russia and China. And this icy island now finds itself at the forefront of international competition. But before we dive into our discussion, I unfortunately have to share some sad news. Our panelist, Sarah Olsvik, is not able to join us today because of a canceled flight. However, I am sure that we are going to have a very interesting discussion, as we are joined today by two experts who have done extensive research into the region and who hopefully will help us unpack all these difficult questions of strategy, of security and resources. And first of all, I would like to introduce Luke Coffey. Luke is a senior fellow at the Center on Europe and Eurasia at the Hudson Institute. He is joining us today from Washington, D.C. Before that, he was working with the Heritage Foundation, and he also served at the UK Ministry of Defence as a senior special advisor to the British Defence Secretary. And I think, Luke, you were the first US American to do so, am I right?
I was the first foreigner, I was told.
Well, that's even better.
Yeah.
And then we also have Jonas Pereiro Plesner. Jonas is executive director at the Alliance of Democracies. And before that, he pursued a very long career at the Danish Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And among the many positions you held, you served as a senior advisor on China and Northeast Asia. And I think it's fair to say that your career was dedicated to Chinese EU and Chinese US relations. So thank you both for being here today. And I'm very much looking forward to learning a lot of you. Luke, perhaps I can start with you. And I think with a key question that a lot of us are asking themselves when they watch the news these days. So why is Donald Trump, I think it's fair to say, so obsessed with Greenland? What is his strategic rationale behind all that?
Great. Well, Anna, thanks for that kind introduction, and thanks to the Atlantik-Brücke for inviting me to participate in this discussion. You know, the only person who really knows what motivates Donald Trump from day to day is Donald Trump. But we all get to watch this show unfold, and we can all make our assessments and our guesses. I think there are probably a number of factors at play here. Firstly, I think President Trump is acutely aware of uh, his need to shape a legacy for himself. After the first term, you know, you had January 6th and you had the response to the pandemic, and he's been given a second chance, which is rare in politics, I think, for the most part. And he is looking and thinking big about his legacy. I think that's one of the reasons why we're seeing this push for a peace settlement between Russia and Ukraine at almost any cost because he wants to be seen as the peacemaker. The deal is about him. It's not necessarily about Russia or Ukraine. And I think with Greenland and the talk of annexing Greenland, there's a very Jeffersonian quality to the idea of American expansionism, which in the context of the 19th century was a little more mainstream than it is today in the 21st century. So I think that may be part of it. Legacy, going down as the president who added, who added a huge chunk of territory to the United States. But also, I think he is genuinely interested and concerned about rare earth minerals and American access to these. And we can talk about this a little bit more later about whether this is even possible with Greenland at this point. But I think he has some concern about that. I think he also has a serious concern about Chinese involvement in the Arctic. This was shown during his first administration when at Arctic Council meetings, the focus on China was the cornerstone of the U.S. approach to that forum, to the Arctic region. But again, we could talk about whether or not China is actually involved heavily in Greenland or not a little bit later. But I would say these are the motivating factors. So you have legacy, rare earth minerals, and China.
And he recently claimed that, and I quote, he needs Greenland to guarantee peace of the entire world. So he clearly sees some strategic value. Is that, I mean, do you share this assessment? Is Greenland actually that important for American security?
Well, one of the positive aspects of this whole debate we're having is now the U.S. policy community is having a debate, having a discussion about Greenland. President Trump is right to highlight the importance of Greenland, especially for the defense of the North American continent. I mean, it's a matter of geography, physics, that the location of Greenland plays a very important role, especially for missile defense, early airborne warning, this sort of thing. Luckily for the United States, we can meet our policy objectives through the current arrangements we have with both the Danish government and the Greenlandic government. Is Greenland vital for global security? I would say no. No disrespect to my Greenlandic friends. Is Greenland vital to the security and defense of the North American continent? Absolutely yes. I often describe, maybe this is because I'm a veteran of the Afghan and Iraq wars, but I like to describe Greenland and Iceland as the forward operating bases of the North American continent. They help us protect, these islands are crucial at protecting the mainland. But this doesn't mean that we have to annex them or invade them and add them to our country. It just means that we need to maintain good relations with the local governments to ensure that we can meet our policy objectives.
So if you say that, it is needed to protect the U.S. territory, I think we also have to look at those you have to protect from. And so I would like to go to Jonas. So you briefly mentioned the wider competition with China. Jonas, you have done extensive research on China's objectives in the Arctic. What is their goal with regards to Greenland, and what kind of moves do we already see?
Thank you, Anna. And thanks to Atlantik-Brücke for having me on, and particularly to Julia, a good friend from my time in DC. So delighted to do this. Maybe for the sake of argument, let me take a little bit issue with Luke, although I think more or less we concur, but to say it's also been the US decision over the last 30 to 40 years to basically cut down Arctic security. So NORAD, the part of the U.S. Army and Pentagon that takes care of the North is basically there were 11 U.S. bases during the Cold War, massive, and now there's one left with 200 soldiers on it. And there's still a defense treaty, which you could even in some ways interpret as somewhat of sort of joint security, if not almost sovereignty. So the US inside that agreement had all the opportunity to sort of expand security. So there is something at play, as Luke was also referring to, specifically with President Trump. It's not that the Pentagon have come and said, we actually really need a larger base in the North to sort of fulfill our security objectives. It does come the other way around, that the president said we need it for national security. And it's not like there is, you could see this also with the Vice President Vance's visit to the base, just maybe trying to get a bit of clarity on, what does the base completely do within Space Command and in missile defense as well, and what could even more be needed. So it's not that we've seen at any point in this debate, which I think both Danes and Greenlanders would be completely open to, if the US said, well, we need much more national security up there. Here are our ideas for expanding it. And so that's just to kind of add a little bit. Then to your questions on China, it's true that China has a bigger interest in the Arctic. They become an observer in the Arctic Council. They consider themselves in a white paper what they call a near Arctic state, which is somewhat ridiculous when they're that many thousand kilometers away from it. But it's of course part of China's more kind of global reach. But we've also seen to a large degree that it's the boogeyman that did not really show. When I was with the European Council of Foreign Relations, a think tank back from 2010 to 2013, I did actually studies on Greenland when the first interest of Chinese mining possible Chinese mining projects kind of emerged, but none of them really happened. Greenland is actually quite hard if we're gonna, which I think we are also gonna discuss, the minerals, which President Trump has also been talking about. And none of these kind of deals really panned out. So it's not that there is a massive economic presence. Then later, from 2016 onwards, the Danish government that still is in charge of defense and security relations for Greenland have been vetoing, and there was in particularly a deal around or public procurement around expanding the airports in Greenland in 2016, where the Danish government stepped in because there was a Chinese provider among them that could have been likely to have won the public procurement, and instead made a sort of a national consortium that won that bid. So it's there, but it's not at all that big. Then you have the Russians. They have been there, you could say always. We have an unresolved claim with the Kingdom of Denmark and Russia, the Russian Federation. That is still a adjournment clause. The UN Maritime Convention being clarified with both sides so far respecting kind of the legal route. So I would say yes, shipping routes are opening more up. The ice is melting. But it's not like that we see a kind of massive sudden presence where China and Russia are all circling around the island, and now it kind of really completely helpless, needs massive sort of defense. So there are these again shift. I'm not sort of neglecting them, but it's not that this is happening kind of massive scale. So again, I think we. And as Luke also said, the one that knows what President Trump thinks best is probably himself. And so it is a little bit hard, but of course it already came in 2019. So I've also had a lot of critique in some of my public writings on this of my own government. Like we knew it from 2019 when he was in office first time, where he said it only once, and I think then National Security Advisor John Bolton and others got him sort of convinced away a little bit from the idea where he was talking about buying Greenland. And so we should have kind of known better and been better be prepared, which is the title of this. I would say that the Danes did not prepare kind of well for it. And we had promised already that time an increasing our Arctic security, and which we've done now and which we're willing to. But in my view, we could have done that kind of earlier as well. So it's not that I don't also see some sort of criticism here. But what has made it completely and quite difficult has been that territorial aspect. Because if you take the security and if you take the economics, and then territory is the last one. I mean, as a former diplomat, having also negotiated for many years with the US government, yes, we could talk about security. I just outlined how in the defense treaty and augmentation of US presence is completely possible. Yes, we could talk about the Greenlanders have for years, and a shame Sarah isn't here to explain that position. They've for years been courting US companies to come and invest and try to take part in some of the investment. They really want that because it's also for some part of, or for all, it's part of Greenlanders, part of economic development. And for some, it's also part of the path to independence from Denmark, of having an independent source of income from mining. But then comes the third one, which is the territory. At the moment when you say, but I also want to annex you or buy you, one, it's sold to Greenlanders. Two, it makes it much harder to negotiate on the two other points because you will always, from the Danish and Greenlandic side, now be worried, but is this just kind of part of them taking over kind of fully Greenland, which on my pragmatic side, I could say it would be possible in the way of having much larger US presence, both security and economic, but without in any way in kind of name trying to say we're now annexing Greenland. That's what makes the situation so hard at the moment.
You both mentioned the mineral resources, and Jonas, you touched upon the topic that China tried to invest or had some projects in planning, but that they failed to materialize. And you also mentioned that the US, back in the past, tried to invest in Greenland. So why is it so hard to, having all these ideas and all the, that interest in Greenland? Why is it so hard to get these projects going?
Well, there are a couple of reasons. I mean, one, it is, as President Trump has seen, it is a huge island up in the north. There are 57,000 people that live there. So there's very little infrastructure. There are no roads between the cities. Many of the areas where you would have to dig there, you would have to develop port, you would have to develop all facilities, basically. That's also my sort of anecdotal from some of the Chinese visit is that I think they found it easier probably to continue mining in Sudan or in Congo and other places in Africa because Greenland basically, and it doesn't have a corrupt government as well. So you would actually have to follow a lot of local regulation on the projects and of course ensure the environmental sustainability as well on these projects. So I think all these reasons and the fact that the Chinese also have this loop, including on the rare earths, which there are a good amount of where they process it to much cheaper than anybody else can do at market prices, meaning that there hasn't at market prices really been any kind of Western companies interested in doing too many of these. And then you could say the Greenlanders, there is a smaller project now that's gone stalemate and has ended up in an international court suit as well, which shows that maybe the regulatory framework and their understanding of what's needed because of the size of each project, meaning that it will both bring in, of course, a lot of money for the Greenlanders, but also how precisely would you handle this? You could discuss whether you should have something like the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund in place before you undertake some of these projects. So in some ways, the Greenlanders, even though they want it, have maybe also not been that prepared for it. At least that's what this current kind of court case I think shows with an investor that feels that they have been not handled properly in their process for application for a mining project.
So, Luke, listening to all that, how hard it is to, get these projects going, even get access to all those resources. I mean, President Donald Trump must have some knowledge of that. Why is he still interested in, trying to access them?
Well, this goes back to the first motivating factor that I mentioned, and this is legacy. I mean, it doesn't matter if these rare earth minerals are extracted in the next few years, but 10, 15, 20 years down the road, if it's possible, then someone could say, oh, this was all made possible due to Donald Trump. And then President Eric Trump or whoever we'll have in the White House then will will remind us daily that this was all made possible due to his father. But in all seriousness, I often ask this myself. You know, when you heard Vice President Vance go to the U.S. base in Greenland and you hear what he said, I wonder, you know, what was he briefed? Are these his personal views, or are these what the policy experts at DoD, at state, in our intelligence services, are these comments being formed by what he's been told? Same with President Trump, and you know, it's also like with our Director of National Intelligence, Tulsi Gabbard. She'll often tweet something that's a bit out there on Ukraine or Syria or Iran, and you're thinking, is this her personal view, or is this her assessment as the Director of National Intelligence? But I don't think really President Trump is too interested in the finer details about how to get these minerals out. The points that were already mentioned about the lack of infrastructure is probably the most important one, but also the environmental conditions. I mean, Greenland, presumably, if these rare earth minerals are there, they are located under an ice sheet that's 3 times the size of Texas, that at its thickest point is 3 kilometers thick. So if all of these rare earth minerals were there to be extracted, then Greenland wouldn't be a poor place. It wouldn't depend on Denmark for its block grant to run the government. It would be a very wealthy and independent place. But it's not, because these minerals aren't available. I would love to see the United States to take steps, practical steps, to boost that economic relationship with Greenland. This June will be the first time since the 1990s that there will be a direct flight from the United States to Nuuk. And it'll be a seasonal flight built around tourism, made possible by the expansion of the airport. For years, at least for the past 10 years or so, there's been a discussion about connecting Portsmouth, Maine with Nuuk on a shipping line. And this has never materialized. Perhaps COVID, this was really ramping up around 2018, 2019, and then COVID hit. Perhaps that had an impact. But there are practical things we can do now to boost that economic relationship. We don't need to talk about annexing the whole country.
Maybe before we move on, so we now touched upon the U.S. strategic interest in Greenland. We spoke about the resources. As you know, this discussion is also meant for us and for the viewers to prepare ourselves. Maybe let's talk a bit about scenarios. So you just mentioned, you know, annexing Greenland, and I think this would be, I mean, just the mere thought of you know, thinking about, I don't know, U.S. soldiers, you know, embarking on a journey to, you know, annex Greenland is, you know, is such a crazy scenario. But how likely is it from your point of view?
My point of view from here in Washington, I would say this is highly unlikely, if not impossible, because firstly, for a few reasons. Firstly, you've already heard the Trump administration tone down the rhetoric. When Vice President Vance visited, he all but explicitly took off the military option. I mean, look, the fact that we're even having this conversation is crazy enough, right? But you know, he all but took off the military option, so to speak, and said that, you know, they want to get closer, have closer relations with the Greenlandic people. And I think they realize that there's no mood or appetite in Greenland for joining the United States. That's the first reason. You've seen a change in rhetoric. Second reason, this would be very unpopular with Trump's base. he campaigned. This whole Greenland thing came out of the blue. Not once during the presidential campaign did we hear anything about Greenland. But we did hear a lot about ending forever wars, ending foreign interventions, more America first, this sort of thing. And you are already seeing on social media some pushback from the MAGA supporters saying we want lower groceries and a secure southern border. We don't want Greenland and Panama. So I don't think there's much public appetite to have a military intervention, and I think this could be part of a larger, a larger ploy to try to put more pressure on the European Union when it comes to the trade war, for example. Because President Trump has threatened tariffs against Denmark, but we all know you can't just put tariffs on just Denmark because they're part of the customs union. So this means that it's automatically uploaded to the EU level, which could suit President Trump in his trade war or his trade actions. But maybe that's giving him too much credit on thinking like too creatively about how to have this debate with the EU about trade. But honestly, I despite the rhetoric and some of the noises coming, I think it's very unlikely that the US is going to invade Greenland. But that being said, maybe after this, I'll check Twitter and discover that it's happened.
Jonas, is this a scenario that is discussed, in the streets of Copenhagen?
Yes and no. I mean, mostly, I think as Luke also as a joke, and there's this campaign about then California could join Denmark instead, which was this kind of fun petition online as well. But of course, it has sparked, it has concrete effects in the sense that it sparked a lot of animosity and sort of local patriotism in the Greenlandic population. It has, of course, also for Denmark, that has been like a staunch ally of the US for 80 years, where actually our first bilateral treaty was on in 41 on the US bases in Greenland, and later with NATO, and then further bilateral treaties. And we have, of course, been in most of the wars that Luke called the US forever wars in both Iraq, Afghanistan, where we lost the highest number per capita of soldiers. So that sense, I would say VP Vance's expression, not just from the base, but more when he was on Fox News, when he talked about Denmark as a bad ally, that of course kind of sort of hurt the Danish population. And in Greenland, it has created this kind of rally around the flag that we now have a unity government consisting of more or less all the parties that are trying to kind of find a pathway forward together. And yeah, and again, of course, we see it also slightly impossible. Also, let's look at it very practically. There are more American soldiers already on Greenland than there are Danish and Greenlandic, because the Greenlandic do not have any soldiers, and Denmark only has, mainly through the fleet, and then the smaller contingent of special forces that do the dock sleighs, which at first sounds a little bit, when people talk about the dock sleighs, it is actually, in a sense, a quite serious and really well-trained soldiers that can go from one side of the other of Greenland on dock sleigh. But so in reality, you could say US is already more military present on Greenland than Denmark is. That's sort of the reality, and it's always been a sort of joint and shared security arrangement for the last many decades. So from that point of view, it's also almost kind of impossible to annex. Of course, it does bring with it mind-boggling questions, since we are both members of NATO and Greenland is NATO territory. Will it then trigger Article 5? Will it trigger Article 4, that you would have discussions when two allies are in some sort of disagreement? And so I don't see it happening. And I do also, as a former diplomat and negotiator for the Danish government with the US government, if you, again, as I said, these three things, security, economics, and then territory. And the two first ones, I think there's a huge willingness to negotiate from both Danish and Greenlandic side. It's just the third one that's non-negotiable of saying you can't just kind of acquire the territory. And and of course then there's a question of trust as well as a sort of for establishing this. I said with more confidence, I would say in early January, these things about we can almost negotiate everything when it comes to security and economics. And of course, the more trust that's eroded, as comments by the vice president about Denmark, then of course it becomes kind of slightly harder. Then if you ask for scenarios, I think my optimistic one would be that this is not, I think, among the top 5 things of President Trump's presidency. So in that sense, I think maybe there is a chance that this is something that ends on the slow burner in some way, or that there is an agreement, in a smaller agreement on security or on economics that can then basically kind of satisfy the kind of buying Greenland bucket. Or that it's not a very heroic strategy, but it's like the punting strategy. The fact that, okay, then it was talked about when Vance was there, and he wanted to do somewhat of a similar visit to Don Jr. That wasn't possible because the Greenlandic population had, since Don Jr. was there, smelled, hey, wait, this is actually for real. So nobody was going to show up and kind of support kind of the MAGA agenda and say, hey, we want to be Americans, apart from a very, very, very small minority. So you could also say, I think that maybe this will be on the agenda from time to others. I don't think it will go away, but it might not erupt into something in this presidency. On the other hand, I do also acknowledge, like Luke, that I think we had underestimated how much President Trump came in the second period with the idea of making a legacy, with the idea of territorial expansion. I also, as a longtime follower of US politics, noted the way in his inaugural speech he spoke about McKinley, a president that's, for most, I think, Europeans around the world, little known, but who was the one who kicked Spain out of the Western Hemisphere, taking Cuba, Guam, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines, and keeping 2 of those as Guam and Puerto Rico as US territories to this day. So if this is his ideal, of course, yeah, then you could, if you wanted, kick out a very small ally like Denmark out of Greenland. But again, I do also think that US politics is quick. There will be midterms next up, and particularly the fact that, as Luke also said, that is it not much more important with eggs and egg prices and inflation than with actually delivering Greenland, which seems more of a sort of personal vanity project. And also for our team from polling, this seems the most unpopular of them. I think Panama maybe, because where there now seems maybe to have been a deal with pushing out the Chinese investor, but there was more like, okay, we build it, now the Chinese are in, and so on. There was even, I would say, more of a legal claim as well of saying, wasn't there, an agreement with the Panamanians back from when President Carter withdrew, that they were not going to let in any other major sort of nation state. But and anyway, this seems to, for the time being, have satisfied that. So I think we could also see, again, as I said before, something less that would be sufficient to sort of put the stamp of saying, oh, I put a much stronger US mark on Greenland. But
Luke, would you like to add up on that?
I think Jonas makes a very good observation, especially when you compare this to the situation with Panama. We were also talking about taking the Panama Canal back by military force, and then after a number of meetings, high-level visits, new agreements were signed. America's interests were secured. The Chinese Chinese were out, and everything seems fine. You talk about scenarios. I categorically ruled out the military scenario. But I think the most likely scenario is something similar to Panama, where the U.S., Denmark, and Greenland sign new agreements, mineral deals. Mineral deals are very fashionable these days in Washington. Mineral deals, trade deals, new trade terms, somehow even though Denmark's in the customs union, I mean, you can just see how all this can be fudged to make it look like something bigger than what it really is. And a new security arrangement, because there's already existing scope to expand the size of the U.S. military presence. So that's not difficult to do either. One aspect of this scenario that might be different from what exists now is at least the perception that Greenland has more competency or more sovereignty on these matters that are normally reserved for Copenhagen. So when I speak to Greenlandic officials, they say, yeah, they would love to have a new agreement with the United States on economic issues or on security issues, but they want their signature on the document, right? So that could be like a slight nuance, a slight change, which could make the Greenlandic government happy, make the Trump administration happy, and it's something that probably, Copenhagen is probably agnostic on at this point. I mean, I think the trajectory for Greenland is independence. I don't think anyone denies this. Perhaps I don't know if Trump's actions have sped this process up or delayed it. I think it's too soon to tell. But having some sort of agreement between the U.S. and the Greenlandic government within a flexible scope of Nuuk's competencies, I think is probably the most likely way forward.
Jonas, touching upon that, when J.D. Vance visited Greenland, he claimed that Denmark for quite some time has, I think, underinvested was the word he used, in Greenland and in its people. Do you think, I mean, is this assessment accurate from your point of view? And is this, to play a bigger role, is this a possible outcome for Greenland from this discussion?
In short, no. If I were my old diplomatic self, I'd probably say yes and no. I mean, on the security side, there is a point that Denmark hasn't invested that much in Arctic security for a while, but nor has the US for decades. Also, as we talked about previously, been downgrading basically the presence in the far north. So, and that's only happening now with that upgrade in sort of Danish security in the Arctic. On the people side, definitely not. I mean, the Greenlandic population, I think, functions under a welfare system or a welfare society, a bit like the Danish one, but maybe not with completely as extensive. But they go to university for free in Denmark. They have free schooling and so on. And I think a lot of Greenlanders have also been looking at this when they had this kind of offer and say, wait, but okay, how are like the both in Canada and Nuna and in Nunavut, the other Inuit people that they speak to? I've been to meetings, Arctic meetings in Greenland, and seen them between sort of the different Arctic people, and of course in Alaska with the Inuits there as well. And they of course see completely different conditions. Also, where a lot of those both in Canada and the US have lost their language because it's basically been pushed over to English. We as sort of Danes have that Danish does also play a big role in the Greenlandic administration, but Greenlandic is on par as language of the land. So in that sense, they've actually managed to develop a lot of their economy. They're still dependent on the subsidies because 80% of what they rely on in the Greenland economy is from fisheries. And now they're trying to develop the tourism industry, but they also want to do it very step by step, so they don't become sort of overfilled with sort of mass tourism, but more sort of exclusive tourism. And that's of course where the mining then comes in as like the big joker. If you could develop just one of these big projects, that would of course completely give some new resources to the Greenlandic government. But no, I mean the Danish government keeps investing each and every year in Greenland. Lots of Greenlanders also live in Denmark, study here, and I think it's 17,000, 20,000 that live here. So if you take that out of a very small population of 57,000, but that still means like a a fourth or a third kind of is also based in Denmark proper. So you have a strong link, but of course this has really spurred internal discussions as well, that maybe a lot of Danes did not at all think about this whole construction of the Kingdom of Denmark and with Greenland as part of the Commonwealth. And now, of course, we all kind of do. The king, which is visiting Greenland here these days. The Greenlandic premier has just been to Denmark these last days. So there's a kind of flurry of meetings. So it's also revitalized and made us a lot think about how we kind of want this relationship to develop. And I can't really speak for the Greenlanders, but I think that their independence is thinking is also a little bit on in at least on the reconsideration. Not that many of the parties still have that as their sort of long-term priority. Also because I think some of them realized if they went for independence very quickly, particularly right now during a Trump presidency, they would of course be facing a US that would be say, hey, but now it's time to sign a new deal with us then, and like which would maybe de facto kind of be similar to an annexation, where I think previously the Greenlandic government is all about this is two opportunities of saying, well, we have the Danes that have paid for us historically and for good reasons, and we could try to make a better deal with the US in some of these areas. And of course, but that would be, in their view, coupled with a road to independence, an economic opportunity, not a road to then becoming a US territory.
Oh, a great example of a region where Donald Trump stirs a debate quite far away from home. Before we move on to the final questions, I would like to remind our viewers that if they have a question for either Jonas or Luke, please feel free to use the chat function here at your Zoom interface to send us some questions. And then we will hopefully be able to discuss them in the last 15 minutes of our session. So if you have not sent your questions yet, now is the final time to do so. And while you are typing in your questions, I will ask Luke and Jonas my final questions. So both of you have been advisors to governments. If you were still an advisor to your, or if you were advisor to your respective governments, what would be, what would you try to convey to them in this conflict? Maybe Luke, you can go first, and then Jonas, we will hear from your ideas for Denmark.
The main point I would make is that in the Arctic region, sovereignty equals stability. And that means respecting the sovereignty of others, but also maintaining the ability and the capabilities to enforce and defend your own sovereignty. And the US has chronically underinvested in Arctic security capabilities through recent years. Especially in terms of icebreakers and other hardened vessels and military installations in Alaska. We need to maybe look more at home about how we can ensure our own sovereignty in the Arctic, and then we need to be able to, we need to respect the sovereignty of others. And in the context of Greenland, this means with Denmark, at least at this point. I would also advise that every policy decision we make in the transatlantic region needs to answer one question before all others. Does this help us remain united? Especially in the context of Ukraine and Russia. Anything we do in the transatlantic community as it pertains to security or geopolitics, anything we do other than Ukraine is secondary. And right now, President Trump is trying to broker an honorable ceasefire between Ukraine and Russia. And he needs as much support and backing from the transatlantic community as possible. Threatening to invade part of your neighbor in the transatlantic community doesn't help that. And so that would be my advice.
Jonas?
Thanks, Anna. I mean, above and beyond, it's my old colleague and friend Jesper Müller, who is our ambassador over there, I think, who does a pretty great job in a very difficult situation. So one, I would use kind of fact-based diplomacy of going out when, you know, there are all these wrong explanations about Greenland and the relationship, and basically just explain the story and sort of the dedication to Arctic security, the relationship with the US, and so on, sort of what's really kind of the foundations of this, because a lot of people don't seem to know that. Then I would maybe a little bit also from having been a diplomat during the first Trump period, look for a broad outreach. I mean, a lot of Trump's decisions are based on meetings with people beyond classical diplomacy. So it's maybe not in Rubio's State Department that you, Secretary Rubio, that you solve all of this. And at least according to some journalists, it was Ron Lauder that kind of spurred Trump on this idea in the first period in 2019 when he first mentioned Greenland. And so I would say you also need to reach out to a broader group, including kind of in the MAGA, and then maybe there make the argument that Luke was also referring to, saying, what does this bring from a kind of, even from America First perspective? It potentially brings you into conflict and even with an ally, and it doesn't necessarily give cheaper eggs in the US. And if you want to have a bigger part in the minerals, I mean, I am pretty convinced that the Greenlandic government, if you don't offend them too much, would be very open, because they actually have the competence as part of the Home Rule agreement with Denmark on the underground, that they would be willing to make deals on the underground, not too dissimilar to what Ukraine is being kind of offered right now. At least if there was a clause in it that guaranteed the US companies and the government would kind of stand behind investments. I think that's what's been lacking kind of earlier. So again, all of these possibilities are there as long as they don't feel kind of the lack of trust and on uncertainty. So all of that I would kind of try to explore, and then maybe the list, as I said before, less heroic is like the punting strategy of also saying, let's just, since it's not on like Trump's top 5 priority, let's not do too much to stir the boat ourselves as well. To if he stops talking about Greenland, there's no reason that we should sort of keep reminding him either.
Well, thank you both very much for your advice. Hopefully someone passes them on. Just a quick reminder to the audience, if you have any questions, please feel free to send them to us via the Q&A button on your screen. Maybe Jonas, a quick question to you while we're waiting for a few questions from the audience. What would be, you know, the Trump administration is quite demanding from Denmark and Greenland, but I mean, what would be, you know, a carrot big enough to, you know, bring them, because right now both Greenland and Denmark, they're like, this is nothing we would ever negotiate. But I mean, what could bring them to the negotiating table? What would President Trump have to offer?
Well, I think, I mean, on both the security basket and the economic basket, I think they are actually quite open to him, which has been part of the message, saying, you know, these topics we can discuss, and we are basically open to more or less any proposal for a large president. But this has just not been combined right now. So it's not that when Vice President Vance went up to the base, he said, okay, I'm here because we're actually looking at a concrete Pentagon proposal, whether to do A, B, and C and expand the base in this way, or even ask the Danes and Greenlanders whether we could build another base as we've had previously. So some of those things came on the table. I think it would be easier to to basically start negotiations, because there aren't really any, and that's why you don't really see any counter offers, because people are just perplexed. If it all starts with a wish for buying or annexation, then that's non-negotiable from Danish Greenlandic side. Then, but all the other is negotiable, but it's not that there's been put forward any proposal in, which is also why I kind of in one of my columns here made that slightly heterodox and heretical in a Danish paper, Berlingske, about that maybe the Greenlanders should propose something like the Ukraine minerals deal, because again, as I said, in principle, sharing 50-50 and actually having US commitment to starting explorations would be better than the current situation, where they don't have any money coming from the mining sector. But of course, I completely understand there's a bit of reluctance right now to, when you don't know what you're really negotiating kind of about, and as long as the kind of the territorial piece keeps being the one that President Trump brings up.
And Luke, is there, are there any preparations being made on the American side, to find something, or to be a bit more constructive, in the discussions with Denmark? Anything that the Americans could offer?
Honestly, I think things have moved on so quickly, even since Vice President Vance's visit. The administration now has bigger issues to worry about, especially in the context of the trade war. So I don't know how much bandwidth is being used inside State Department, the NSC, DOD on the specific issue with Greenland. I think we all, remember, a lot of this started before they entered the Oval Office. During that transition period, when you had spare time and you didn't have the pressures of governing on you. And I think when Vice President Vance's wife had to basically change her whole trip, and then also remember, Vice President Vance did this video where he said, "I'm not going to have her have all the fun. I'm joining." And then they end up just going to a U.S. military base. I mean, it was so absurd. The amount of taxpayers' money that was used for the advanced part of that visit, right? When all the Secret Service flew into Nook, and I mean, it was a joke, really. So I think that was kind of a wake-up call, maybe, that maybe the Greenlandic people don't want to be American, but they do want to have business relationship. They want to do have that security relationship, but they don't want to be American, and they just want to be independent. And a country like America that's been founded on the principle of self-determination, we should support this idea, not go against it. So I don't see much discussion happening on this these days. To be honest with you, in Washington, everyone's focused on Israel and Iran, China and the trade war, and what's happening with Russia and Ukraine. The whole Greenland, Panama, even the Canada rhetoric has kind of taken a back burner in recent weeks.
Thank you very much. We have a very interesting question from the audience that I think is meant for the both of you. How do you assess the possibility of some sort of deal between the Trump administration and Russia to collaborate in the Arctic?
I think it's very likely, unfortunately. I could see, well, you've already seen the rhetoric coming from the White House about improving the economic relationship with Russia, increasing trade. There are a lot of U.S. energy companies that fled that would probably like to go back. But practically, I don't know what it would amount to, but symbolically, it would be important for the Kremlin. So I could, another thing, another aspect of this is with the Arctic Council. The U.S. could lead efforts to normalize the Arctic Council, get it back to how it was operating before Russia's large-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022. So yeah, I could certainly see a situation where the Trump administration reaches out to Moscow for cooperation in the Arctic. But also, I believe it's hopelessly naive to think that it would advance America's interests.
Jonas, what about you? Do you agree with Luke? Do you think there would be some sort of symbolic agreement?
No, I agree. And I think it's part of the Trump administration's outreach to Russia as part of these, from a European point of view, I think not very great efforts at a peace in Ukraine. That they want to also do bilateral things with Russia, including on potential on some of the oil projects that have where we could end up in this paradoxical situation that then it would be Europeans sort of trying to sort of stop sanction evasions through the US if there's only a US company that became involved in Arctic oil drilling with the Russians, or even worse, with starting up Nord Stream or something like that, which is not Arctic, but based in the Baltic Sea.
And do you both think that this could already be part of the bigger discussions with Russia on Ukraine?
I think so. I mean, at least we hear rumors of like that they're looking at all sorts of ways of restarting our cooperation. And I remember from earlier times that this was always one of the things the Russians put in the back would be like something about Arctic and sort of joint oil exploration. And so I could definitely see President Trump and his team being kind of tempted by that, and Putin, who's been around the block for quite a number of years, throwing in some of his old tricks, including something that sounded nice in the Arctic.
And Luke, what about you? Do you agree?
Yeah, I agree that Russian American cooperation in the Arctic could be part of the Ukraine talks, but it'll be something that at the very last minute, Putin will foist onto Steve Witkoff and say, oh, here's another fantastic idea that can benefit both of us right before they sign any agreement. And then Witkoff will come back and talk about the close history of American-Russian cooperation in the Arctic, going back to the purchase of Alaska in 1867 and all this stuff. I could see it now. And then that's how it would materialize. I don't think it's like central to the talks right now, but I could definitely see the Russian negotiators being savvy enough to work this in somehow throughout the process.
I think that's something that we will all see play out in front of our eyes in the coming weeks. I'm very much looking forward to see if you are right, Luke, if they're coming back with some sort of, paragraph on the Atlantic in whatever paper it is they are, discussing about right now. Unfortunately, our time is up today, but I would like to thank both of you very much for your time, and especially for those intriguing insights. I think like I myself, and I'm sure everyone watching, they have learned a lot, not only about Greenland and the view of the Danes on this debate, but also on the rationale of the Trump administration. So thank you both for enlightening us. And lastly, of course, thanks a lot for everyone watching on the screen. Everyone have a nice afternoon, evening or morning, wherever you are watching. And thank you very much and goodbye.